Hi, my name is Alison Yates and I'm one of the programmers of the Red Line Book Festival, which is brought to you by South Dublin Libraries. This is our 10th anniversary festival and we're delighted to bring you at least 84 events, both live and in person. For more information, check out redlinebookfestival.ie and the programme runs until the 17th of October. This year's festival book is The Magician by Colm Tóibín, about the life and work of Thomas Mann. We are delighted to have noted academic Tobias Boes talking about his book, Thomas Mann's War, with Irish academic Rebecca Braun. Closing us out on Sunday the 17th of October is Colm Tóibín talking to author Kevin Power about his book, The Magician. But first, let's explore Thomas Mann's War with Tobias Boes in conversation with Rebecca Braun.
Hi, and thank you very much. Really excited to be talking to you today, Tobias, about your new book, Thomas Mann's War, Literature, Politics and the World Republic of Letters, which I have really enjoyed reading over the last few weeks. It's given me so much to think about, and I'm just really excited to explore these ideas with you. Thought I might just kick off with a little personal anecdote of how I've come to Thomas Mann over the course of my life, and it was actually as an undergraduate student, of German, which is perhaps where some of the people in our audience today will be coming from, but many others will have encountered Thomas Mann in different forms as well. So I encountered him through the study of German, and I guess as the quintessential 20th century German writer. And I would imagine even if you hadn't encountered him that way, if you've read him in English, and you might have read his big first and major novel, Buddenbrooks, or a shorter one, perhaps Death in Venice, or you might have seen the film of Death in Venice, or you might have gone into his later work and come across Dr. Faustus and read that alongside an interest in World War II. There are lots and lots of ways people might have encountered Thomas Mann. But I suspect that those readers also were reading Thomas Mann to find out about Germany. And the really exciting thing from your book, I think, is that I read this book to find out about America and how Thomas Mann fits into a certain American 20th century. So that's been a real kind of mind shift for me to think about Mann in those terms. And I'm just really curious then about what motivated you to take that approach to him.
Sure. So first of all, thank you very much, Rebecca, for interviewing me. And I'm very, very sorry I couldn't be in Dublin right now, but I'm glad that we get to do this in this virtual format, at least. It's probably a good idea to start with the personal connection to Thomas Mann here, because my book, too, was very much motivated by that. And there are certain parallels in the way that I encountered him to the way that you, from your description, encountered him. So I first read Thomas Mann in high school in Germany, growing up in Germany. He's still commonly taught in the high school curriculum. Some of the short stories are, at least. I didn't much take to him at that point, but I guess it resurfaced back when I was in college and then in graduate school, and I eventually ended up writing a dissertation that was partly on Thomas Mann. But the way in which that relates to this book and to some of the themes about Germanness that you just already talked about, is that I got the idea for first writing this book actually the day that I got my PhD in German. So I was celebrating with my family, and my mother gave me as a graduation gift, so to speak, gave me a copy of Der Zauberberg, of the Magic Mountain, that had been in the family for some time. And it was a copy that my grandfather gave to my mother when she first graduated from college. So my mother was the first person in the family to have graduated from college. My grandfather was not a particularly educated man. And then my mother gave it on to me as I had completed my PhD. Now, this is a very German story, because I'm convinced, and I'm saying this without wanting to cast any kind of aspersion on either my mother or my grandfather, I'm fairly convinced that neither of them had actually read the novel. The symbolism was just having the novel on your bookshelf, having a copy of The Magic Mountain on your bookshelf. That seemed to be the appropriate gift for educational achievement. And so, I received the gift and I sort of set it aside. I had just spent several years reading and writing on the Magic Mountain. I wasn't particularly interested in returning to the novel at that point. But a few years later, I took the novel off of my bookshelf because I wanted to read the preface. The preface of the novel is very famous, probably the most famous part of the novel overall. And I wanted to reacquaint myself with it. And I was kind of taken aback by the fact that when I opened the book, where I thought the preface would be, there was a short text that began with a salutation, gentlemen, in the German version, the word gentleman. And of course, I should have known this from my past research in the Magic Mountain. The Fischer Verlag, Thomas Mann's German publisher, starting in the late 1930s, actually prefaced all of its edition of the Magic Mountain with a short lecture that Thomas Mann had given at Princeton for undergraduate students of German there. And the Fischer Verlag clearly felt that people who had been unable to read Thomas Mann closely or hadn't been able to relate to Thomas Mann very much during the time of the Nazi regime, that it would be beneficial for them to have this kind of explication that had originally been written for American undergraduates there as well. And so I thought this was very curious, that a book that I had inherited precisely to signify Germanness would have this marker of American identity and reaching out to an American audience and trying to make the novel understandable to an American audience. That the German edition would have that at the front of it, and that I would have now inherited this. So that's how I began this. And the central question of the book, as you already pointed out, is how does Thomas Mann really interact with the American century? How was he received by American readers? But then also, how did that in turn change the reception of Thomas Mann back home in Germany in the way that it did when I encountered him there? And so I began work in that vein. And then, 2016, the American elections, Trump happened, the political landscape changed. And suddenly the political dimension of Thomas Mann's American existence also became of great interest to me. The fact that he had fought against fascism, he had given all these speeches against fascism, he had given radio broadcasts. And I came to understand that those two things were actually intertwined with one another, because in many cases, it was the U.S. Army that brought Mann's books back to Germany at the end of the Second World War. And that's how the book came to be.
Wow, that's just a fascinating personal account, but also opens up all sorts of things for us to talk about, I think. And I love the different timescales you've got going on there. That on the one hand, there's the historical kind of look back in your own family and how Mann represented something quite deep rooted sense of a German. A German identity. I suppose it's linked to the ideas of the Bildungsbürgertum, so a particular thirst for knowledge in a particular sector of the population, and how that plays out historically. But you've also brought it up right to the present, where you're saying, you're looking at how what Mann was doing actually seems quite relevant today as well, and in the context of global politics. So I'd love to hear a little bit more on that, just, on the present moment, and the fact that, so you've already identified that what you thought was the ultimate cultural symbol of German identity actually can be made to carry all sorts of other things now. So maybe could you just share with us some of your ideas about that very contemporary relevance? Why thinking about Thomas Mann now is not going to take us down the line of ceremonially gifting Thomas Mann to one another to show that we're well read, but is actually going to give us something that we can use to make sense of our lives today.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, there's worse things in life than ceremonially gifting great authors, I guess. But that's really. You're right that that's not the kind of narrative that I was trying to serve in writing this book. So yeah, I did, as one does when you are an academic trying to build a career, I was trying to find novel ways to talk about Thomas Mann, right? Things that would differ from the ways in which he had been talked about in the past. And you've already mentioned one of those ways, the inversion of, instead of looking at using him as a lens to look at Germany, using him as a lens to look at America. That was something that I, of course, did quite intentionally, and that appealed to both an American audience, and now the book is about to come out in German translation as well, and it's been gathering a lot of interest in Germany as well. But certainly the thing that I tried to do that you just hinted at is that I was very dissatisfied with the way in which Thomas Mann is just generally read as a signifier of tradition, you mentioned the Bildungsbürgertum, so in English we would say the educated bourgeoisie, I guess, of a social stratum that essentially was coming to an end already in Thomas Mann's lifetime, right? The kind of idea that you define your middle class existence through how well you are read and the books that are on your bookshelf, that in the post-war period that would become less and less important. And so I didn't want to pursue scholarship in that regard. And I wanted to instead talk about how Thomas Mann is still relevant in the 21st century and for how he speaks to particularly 21st century problems. And nobody was really doing that, perhaps. And by contrast, I was struck by the fact that here you have a person who spends, more than a decade in American exile, before that French and Swiss exile. So he's abroad for quite a while. He has to deal with the fact that there is a dictatorial regime in his home country. He has to deal with the fact that while he still writes in German, his books become increasingly difficult to access for the audience that he would like to write for, the audience in his own nation state. And instead, he's being received by an increasingly international audience and is being received increasingly in translation. And that is something that is very common in the 21st century, maybe not for European authors anymore, but for authors from the developing worlds, authors who flee poverty or who come from countries where there's not a large inherent readership, or who flee from dictatorial regimes. That kind of thing, right? That kind of author experience. It's weird to see Thomas Mann as a forerunner for those kind of authors, but I think in many ways he was, and that's what I really tried to bring out.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to develop that as well, which is when you think about the 21st century writer experience of having a sort of a parallel existence in translation, which is maybe going to be their main readership. In fact. There's often a kind of a not so much a genre shift, but a shift in kind of status, as it were, of the literature, and it's to do with the slightly weird status of translated literature in English. I suppose I'm talking about the Anglophone world that these writers are perhaps coming into, where fiction that is seen and marketed as translated fiction is automatically assumed to be a bit highbrow. I'm not quite sure why, because it doesn't make a whole heap of sense. And of course, you can translate all sorts of genres, and all sorts of genres are translated. But broadly, if it's some kind of literary fiction, if it's translated, it tends to get marketed as in a more highbrow space. But I was really, really struck in your book that you show how Thomas Mann goes from, we've already outlined a little bit, his canonical status, the symbolism that attends him in the German context as being the representative, serious author for Germany. But that you talk about the middle brow, and that Thomas Mann, deliberately or not, and that's something that you trace out, but that he increasingly perhaps is positioned or positions himself in a middle brow space. So I wonder if you could just speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's two threads here, I think, that are worth pulling out. The first thing is that you said in your last sentence, you sort of hesitated between he positions himself and he is positioned. Yeah. And that tension between the two, that's very central to my book, right? Because we oftentimes talk about authors and the work that they do to, they tour book festivals like this one, and they give lectures, and they appear on television, or in the previous age on radio and so on. The things that they do to promote themselves, we less often talk about the fact that there are many other actors involved in that positioning process as well, right? And to the point that sometimes authors can, as happened with Thomas Mann, they can acquire reputations that are quite different from the ones that they would have probably mapped out for themselves had they been able to do that. And for Thomas Mann, who arrived in the United States speaking fairly little English, knowing absolutely nothing about American culture, and even by the time that he left, his English was still not very good, and his understanding of American culture was much better, but still far from perfect. So it was, for him, it was a very strange kind of place. Thomas Mann was very much dependent on other people to establish that reputation for him, and that resulted in sometimes strange constellations. And that is what I'm trying to draw out in the book very much. And I also try to show the wonderful thing about Thomas Mann, the reason why he was so successful over a fairly long period of time in the United States. So from roughly the mid-1920s to maybe the mid or late 1940s is when his great period of popularity in the United States is, right? And it begins to wane in the late 1940s for reasons that we'll talk about later, perhaps. But the point is that during that time period, American culture shifted quite dramatically as well. And the way in which he was received shifted. And the marvelous thing is that various actors, so his agent, his publisher, his translators, various critics that were interested in Thomas Mann for different reasons, they all contributed to keeping Thomas Mann relevant during that time period. And that's what the book talks about. And one of the central features of that, and probably the most hotly contested, because a lot of people react sort of in an allergic way to my use of the term middlebrow, is that I do try to point out that a fairly consistent feature of his reception in the United States is that people try to downplay that highbrow element almost from the very beginning. So there was very little talk about Thomas Mann's style. There was very little talk about him as a quote-unquote modernist author, right? There was talk about the philosophical content of his novels. I mean, Mann's novels are famous for the fact that they discuss ideas, right? That they delve into questions of both philosophy, but also contemporary issues, sometimes political issues, social issues. If you think of the great debates in the Magic Mountain about what society should be like, ultimately, right? Those were talked about, but they were always presented to an audience as something that would be very accessible and would be of very practical use value to the audience as well. The idea was, go read the Magic Mountain because it'll really help you orient yourself in modern life. It was not, go read the Magic Mountain so you can experience the very best of thought or commune with your great mind. It was a very practical dimension to it. And that, to me, nowadays we oftentimes use the term middlebrow as an insult, right? But when the term was originally coined, that's not what it was. In American culture in the 1930s, the term middlebrow is used very consciously to refer to literature that stands between the aspirations of the highbrow, but also kind of the mindless reading of the lowbrow, and that has a use value for practical life. That's what the middlebrow genre was originally supposed to signify. And Thomas Mann, I think, was slotted into that. Now, he wasn't aware of that. He probably wouldn't. He would have had very mixed feelings about that. But if you look at the promotional strategies, that's very clearly what is happening. And that promotional strategy is developed and taken in slightly different directions, but ultimately built upon later in the 1930s and in the 1940s as well. As the United States transitions to war, other things become important. For instance, in the late 1940s, when the United States started erecting prisoner of war camps for German soldiers in the United States, Thomas Mann was chosen as an author of re-educational literature for the POWs. They were essentially given the Magic Mountain to read to get back to a different conception of Germanness. This is another example of how America intervenes in these conceptions of Germanness. And the reason why Thomas Mann was chosen was because of this middlebrow legacy. There was this reputation that these are very practical books. They can have a practical purpose. They can be educational. And that was appropriated and put into a different context in these POW.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm thinking two things I want to ask you just to develop this point a little bit further, because I think it's just totally fascinating. The first is the actual practicalities, and it may be unfair because I might be asking you to remember details that will elude you, but I was very struck how you spoke about the use of biblical patterns and ideas in terms of what, and in that case, man maybe is deliberately doing something, because this is to do with, choices he makes in speeches that he gives, and even in structures underpinning some of his novels, that he is deliberately bringing in a canon of literature that a broad public will be familiar with. So in that sense, making the more highfalutin ideas and style accessible in other ways. So that would be something that he's deliberately doing, actually. So that was one thing I'd like, if you have ideas to share with our listeners, I'm sure they'd be interested in that. And the other one is the Book of the Month Club, which in a way just illustrates further the point you were making. But you draw that through. It keeps coming up, and then he writes another novel. And each time I read, and that was put on the list for the Book of the Month Club, I was like, really? Wow, this is the most kind of high. In my head, I'm still in that German mode. I was like, wow, what a highbrow Book of the Month Club. It's not really like your local reading group. So I was continually surprised. So either of those, which one do you want to take first, or at all?
Well, I mean, we can briefly chat about both of them if you want to. I'll start with the Book of the Month Club, just because that I think is slightly earlier. I don't have the exact dates at my fingertips, but the discrimination through the Book of the Month Club starts in the mid-1930s. I would say maybe 1936 was the first Mann title that was disseminated sometime around then. And I think that's a fairly good example of how a handful of powerful players can really alter the reception of an author by, in this case, simply putting them on the list for the Book of the Month Club. So Book of the Month Clubs were a veritable mania, a real rage that started in the United States in the late 1920s. I mean, it actually, the first Book of the Month Clubs date back from Germany, but I don't think they've ever had the same cultural force anywhere in Europe that they did in the United States in the 30s and 40s when they were in their heyday. And the reason for that is fairly simple. The United States is an enormously large country with, at that time, not that many large cities and a lot of scattered settlements. And there weren't a lot of bookstores. Right, that infrastructure just didn't exist. And so if you had aspirations to educate yourself, this is how we get back to the middle brow, right? If you had aspirations to have slightly more demanding literature, and to also take part in sort of a national conversation about books and ideas, if you wanted to feel connected to something larger, pretty much the only way to do that was to have the book sent to you in the mail. And the easiest way to do that was through the Book of the Month Club, where you would essentially get sent a book every month, and you could add titles to that and so on. And the people who ran the Book of the Month Club were very conscious of that sort of educational task that they had. And they also happened to be really intrigued, and in some cases were personal friends with the Mann family. And that's how Mann ended up on those lists and ended up being disseminated over and over again. And one of the things that I did in my book, I actually tried to dig into how many titles were sold of individual novels. And one of the things that I discovered was that while the sales for Thomas Mann were quite formidable, I mean, his best titles sold around 200,000 copies, which for an ultimately very demanding author like Thomas Mann, I mean, no matter how he was marketed, he is still very difficult to read. Those are impressive numbers, but they're actually lower than the average Book of the Month Club book. So it was not that he was put back on those lists over and over again because he sold so well. It was definitely a kind of missionary drive behind that on the part of the people that ran the club and wanted people to read Thomas Mann. And I guess missionary drive is the key word that also gets us to the other half of your question, the religious language. That's certainly true. And the question of Thomas Mann's religion, especially during the time of his exile in America, is a really interesting one that for many decades was ignored. And there's been a lot of really interesting scholarship on that in past years. I think it's definitely true that he started to take an interest in religious ideas that wasn't there when he was younger. That's maybe not that uncommon a phenomenon. But I think it's also, as you pointed out, it's true that he was very conscious of that a certain prophetic rhetoric could serve him very well in his task. So one of the things that he did during the Second World War, I mentioned his sort of anti-fascist activities earlier on. And for the people who are not familiar with Thomas Mann's biography and who haven't read my book, I mean, the most important things that he did was he went on a lot of very long lecture tours all throughout the United States, where he gave talks with titles like The Coming Victory of Democracy or The War in the Future. So talks that were about contemporary events, but also approached them in a sort of more abstract kind of fashion, right? I mean, will democracy ultimately vanquish fascism, or is fascism just the more appealing political system for most people? Is there something within democracy? Does it have inner vitality? Those kinds of questions. Those he discussed with an American audience. And the other thing that he did was that he recorded what were essentially propaganda broadcasts for the BBC. He recorded them in America. They were transmitted to London, and then they were broadcast into Europe by the BBC in German. And Mann figured out very quickly that a certain kind of prophetic diction would serve him very well. So he already had this reputation of being this very, in Germany, of being this very highbrow kind of author. That played into that. And then he realized that he would be totally disembodied in Europe. Nobody would ever be able to see him, probably not even see photos of him. In many cases, not be able to access books of him. He would speak only through the radio to people, and only in secrecy. I mean, you couldn't listen to the BBC, obviously, in Germany, in any kind of public or even semi-public setting. You had to kind of do it under your blanket with a volume way turned down low, and a very sort of intimate relationship. And he figured out that this sort of prophetic diction might be very effective in that regard. And it permeates his writing of the time period as well. And I think that's another way in which he spoke to an American audience, because the America at the time was also grappling with its own religious identity. This is a time where Jews in America start having social influence for the first time, are not just the objects of discrimination, but are tentatively, getting first posts in academia and politics and so on. And so the United States was reinventing itself as a Judeo-Christian nation in war with godless fascism. Most of us are familiar with the Cold War phrase, godless communism, politicians like to use. But before that, there was godless fascism in political rhetoric in the United States. And Thomas Mann fit in very, very nicely with that. And that, I think, contributed to his reputation as well.
Yeah, gosh. I want to pick up on the war, actually, seeing as we've kind of got there in our in what you were saying in that last piece. And actually, just on a really sort of superficial level, invite you to reflect on your title, Thomas Mann's War, because, of course, it kind of... So what do you think when you see that? You think, oh, it will be about the World War. That's sort of the obvious link. But I'm really conscious of how we use combative language in all sorts of metaphorical senses all the time as well. And so I think there's a lot more going on in your book than just talking about the fact that he went into exile and to a degree combated fascism, I suppose, from America, as you've set out really, really clearly. There are other wars going on as well, metaphorical ones, or I might invite you to imagine what else should we be reading into your title?
Yeah, that's a good question and a difficult question. I mean, whenever I write, I struggle with a title to to give to my essay or to my book or whatever. In this case, the title for the book eluded me for a long time as well, and eventually it just hit me, and I thought, this is simple, this is catchy, this will work really well. I think what I wanted to draw out was there was a certain combativeness there. I wanted to show that Thomas Mann, who is oftentimes by people who don't like him, is dismissed as being overly wordy, of being overly aloof and patrician, and not even all that deep in his ideas. I wanted to show that he did have a powerful social role to play in America. I mean, it's not, he of course, he didn't actually go to war. His children, this is maybe worth mentioning, that his children actually did serve the American armed forces and were with the U.S. Army when it invaded Germany. So that's a really interesting moment as well that I talk about only very briefly. Thomas Mann, of course, didn't do that. He was much too old at that time and certainly not the right person for that kind of role. But I do wanted to draw out that the essays that he wrote, the lectures that he gave, they were important not only in the way in which they motivated people, and we have concrete examples of people that clearly were motivated by listening to Thomas Mann, both amongst his German audience and amongst an American audience. But I also wanted to show that in doing that, he was thinking through the role that public intellectuals and especially public literary intellectuals can play in the public sphere, right? And this gets us back then to the 21st century and to later periods when we oftentimes we expect writers to not only talk about literary matters, but to comment on social affairs in their home countries, or when writers are on talk shows, it very rarely sticks to just literary questions, but they're brought into dialogue with other people and oftentimes asked to comment on things of wider social and political significance. And I think that's interesting that Thomas Mann could possibly be seen as a forebear in that regard as well. You talked about what other wars were going on. I mean, I suppose that already partially answers that question. Certainly one thing that I've become interested in more recently since writing the book, that is hinted at in the book, but is not sort of fully developed, is the question of what Mann's political stance within the democratic spectrum was like. Was he a conservative? Was he a liberal? Was he possibly even a social democrat or a socialist? I think those questions have never been fully answered. You can make arguments for any of those positions. And it's interesting because this is, of course, in the United States, this is the time of the New Deal, and then the end of the New Deal and sort of the Eisenhower period afterwards, at the very tail end of his exile and communist witch hunt and so on. The United States itself is trying to figure out what kind of democracy are we. And Thomas Mann is interwoven in that, as he's a minor player, of course. He doesn't have a great influence on politics, but he has opinions on these subject matters, and his reception in the United States is affected by that as well. So I've been writing on that recently about how Americans received his sometimes very left-wing utterances and sort of transformed them into something that was more palatable for a mainstream American audience. And I've also become interested in debates about immigration and immigrants as a possible threat to national identity, which is also something, of course, that happened at the time with the attack on Pearl Harbor. Suddenly, all Japanese Americans and Asian American citizens in general were suddenly suspect. But also, the United States was trying to figure out, what are we going to do with all these emigres from Europe that are coming here? Are they an asset to our national community? Are they a threat? And that is also something that Thomas Mann relates to and that I'm very interested in.
Yeah. We might just sort of do a little metaphorical sidestep on that general point of kind of cultural exchange and maybe a little bit of appropriation. And I'm thinking here of how, so you certainly set out how Thomas Mann engages with Goethe. Of course, if you're looking for the quintessential Germanness, all roads in the end lead to Goethe, whether you like it or not. And Thomas Mann certainly makes plentiful use of Goethe in both the German context when he's speaking to writing and speaking to writing for and speaking to a German audience, but also in the American context, he was conscious of drawing on a certain tradition and repackaging it for American listeners. And I'm kind of conscious here that the strand we're speaking in this book festival is one where we're also looking at Colm Tóibín's work, The Magician, and Tóibín's interest in Thomas Mann, and obviously his book has engaged at great depth with Mann's biography as well, but coming from a totally different angle on things. So just kind of curious, I guess, actually. Maybe it's a little bit of a stretch, but just keeping the idea of war, but in that metaphorical sense of struggle and asserting yourself and, staking out a place, holding a place in a cultural canon. So we're thinking more about how writers engage with traditions and make the case for one thing or another on the back of each other often enough. Really just would like to invite you to reflect on any of that, whether it's to talk more about Mann and what he does with Goethe, or to move into thinking about Colm Tóibín and what he's doing by showing this interest in Thomas Mann, whichever way you'd like to take it.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, as you already pointed out, Thomas Mann was obsessed with Goethe for pretty much his entire life, but especially for the period of, when he was older, starting in his 50s and so on. So he was specifically obsessed with the older Goethe as well, right? With the Goethe of the early 19th century, who has settled into a well-established social position, who's hanging out in Weimar at court, has all these offices, has all this influence, is simultaneously known as a man of letters, as a writer throughout Europe, really has correspondences, far-flung correspondence network, and so on, and already in his own lifetime sort of represents the very best of German letters and of German thought, and is very self-conscious of that, and also turns that into his own personal image, right? Even in his private life, sort of never seems to shed that cloak, this representative facade that he has, is very unapproachable even in private life. And so Thomas Mann was very interested in that because he too had these very self-conscious representative aspirations. And then, of course, as he moved to the United States, there was a very practical function to that as well, because it was evident to everyone that he had these representative aspirations. And he was looking for he was looking to Goethe for guidance in how to inhabit that role, right? How do you act when you're in the limelight? How do you separate your personal fears and anxieties, of which he had many? If you read his diaries, I mean, he had a really moving, a lot of unhappiness in the family, a lot of suicides amongst his children, his siblings, right? I mean, he had a in many ways a rough personal life, but that's not something that he could exhibit in public. He needed this impenetrable facade, and Goethe very important to him for that, and that crept into his writing as well, to the point that most famously he writes, or he begins the novel already in the mid 1930s, but sort of the first major thing that he publishes after arriving in the United States in 1938 is the novel Lotte in Weimar, which is a historical novel about Goethe, and a novel that to fully appreciate, you really have to know a lot about Goethe's life. It's in some English versions, it's called The Beloved Returns, and it's a novel about how in old age, Goethe re-encounters the great love of his youth, the great love that inspired the Werther novel, and the miscommunication that results, because Goethe just can't, he is so much the representative writer that he can't engage with this person on any personal level anymore. It's a comic novel. it's a fantastic novel. It's actually possibly my favorite Thomas Mann novel, but it's also a novel that if you're not very well versed in German letters and know a lot about Goethe already, you're going to struggle with. And one of the things that I found interesting is that he chooses to pursue this project and publish it even after it's become clear to him that the center of his life is going to shift to the United States, right? He has to be able to anticipate that not a lot of people are going to be able to appreciate this novel, but it's important enough for him that he writes it nonetheless. So that I found very interesting, and that encapsulates his relationship with Goethe. Now, Colm Tóibín clearly does not relate to Thomas Mann in the same way as Mann related to Goethe, but it's also clear that he is interested in him Thomas Mann was also a closeted gay writer. That is clearly a central part of his identity that is drawn out in The Magician, that is investigated at great length. And that's something that he already investigated in The Master earlier on with Henry James. So there's clearly that kind of level of positioning as well. I guess the question of how does the personal relate to the public is very central to The Magician as well, right? It's not a novel that is at all concerned with the representative facade that Thomas Mann builds up. With his action in the external world, you get very little of that actually of how Thomas Mann moves in the social world in The Magician. But it is a novel that's very interested in how the innermost can or cannot be communicated to the outside world in your writing. So I see a similarity there.
I suppose that's one of the key differences between academic writing and literary fiction as well, is that the thing that is really in many ways remains thoroughly speculative is the inner world. And, so that you and I may take an academic approach to understanding Thomas Mann and the phenomenon of Mann and the phenomenon of his literature. But, we're not really going there to that kind of place where Colm Tóibín has gone with his novel.
If I can interrupt very briefly, I think that's what makes the novel such a really exciting intervention. That a lot of academics have tried to penetrate into his personal life, but I don't think that's a very good approach. That's not what academic literature, what critical analysis, this kind of reduction to biographical data is not very productive. But the fictionalization and parts of the novel, Tóibín knows Mann very well, and a lot of in that novel is based on things that actually happened, but there's fictionalization there as well. Very productive fictionalization, I think, that helps us understand what Thomas Mann's inner life might have been like much better than we otherwise would.
Yeah. Just, I'm kind of conscious of time. We've been zipping along, enjoying ourselves here. We probably need to bring things to a close fairly soon. But I can't finish the conversation with you without giving you a little bit of a hard time, Tobias, on the maleness of everything. Yes. This is partly because, wow, it is a really male world. And it doesn't surprise me one bit that when you go to retrace the networks around Thomas Mann, or maybe when Colm Tóibín goes to look around Thomas Mann, that what we're getting is a very male version of cultural and political life. But there are women around. Yes. Women did live as well. And those networks did have links out to women, and there were probably women in some positions of power, although not perhaps the conventional ones. So just to be interested in your thoughts on, in a way, the challenge of writing a book like this and retracing an author where, from our 21st century perspective, the gender balance is not great.
Yeah, that's absolutely fair criticism. There was actually a woman that was a major power player in the dissemination of Thomas Mann in the United States, and that's Agnes Mayer, who was the wife of the publisher of the Washington Post, and thus had millions at her disposal, and took great interest in Thomas Mann, and used both her money and her social connections amongst the Washington elite to really help disseminate Thomas Mann and make him more widely read and more widely known. She's the one, for instance, that helped Thomas Mann get a position at the Library of Congress. That's another way in which he contributed to the war activities. He gave regular lectures at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. that were attended by the Washington elite. And she made that possible. She's not very present in my book because she's been extensively written about, and I kind of felt that I would be just retreading ground, and my book would be possibly dismissed if I just covered things extensively that had already been written about. But it's true that her absence contributes to that sort of gender imbalance that you described. But I think the most important omission that I wasn't conscious of at all when I wrote the book, and have only more recently become conscious of and regret now, is that two of the most important women that made Thomas Mann's, that sustained and made possible Thomas Mann's career in the United States, were his wife Katja and his eldest daughter Erica. Katja sort of ran all the public-facing side of the Mann enterprise. I mean, if you wanted to get to Thomas Mann, you basically had to go through her. She controlled access to her husband. And Erica served as one of his chief translators, not of the fiction itself, but when they were on the road and he needed to communicate with people, she was always by his side and translated for him. And she also greatly influenced his ideas about America because she traveled herself quite a bit. And her English was very good. She was much younger, obviously. She was his daughter. So, she had an important mediating influence. And I cut those two people out because I wanted to get away from the biographical side. I wanted to get away from the family enterprise. I wanted to talk about the public persona that Thomas Mann was. And I realized only after I completed the book that the two are actually inseparable. The family, it was a family enterprise ultimately, right? The family helped create the public image, oftentimes in very weird ways, because the people that he was most intimate with helped him create this unapproachable facade, this emotionless, this block of ice that you so oftentimes also see in Tóibín's novel. The family helped to actively sustain that. And I should have written more about that in the book, and I hope to do so in the future.
Sounds a bit like Thomas Mann's Women is coming. Maybe that's not the title you're going to want for it. Women's Thomas Mann. I don't know, but there's certainly more to be said on it. You do have one really lovely example of it's Erica, isn't it? The eldest daughter, and how she's sends a telegram back to him from London, where they obviously have a private joke going on, which totally bemuddles or befuddles the authorities who read the telegram. So it is clear you are pointing out those lines as well. Listen, I'd like to give you the last word for everybody who's been listening in, and it is on a sort of a version of the book of the month that, as I said at the outset, we've got people. So some of whom may well have read Thomas Mann a long time ago and are thinking, which one should I return to? They may have read in German. They may be coming from that side of things. And there may be others who've never read anything by Thomas Mann and don't feel particularly well informed to go looking at his intersections with Goethe, for example. So if you had to recommend a few books for different kinds of purposes, which ones would you choose and why?
Well, I would always begin with Thomas Mann in the way that I began when I was assigned Thomas Mann in high school, which is with the short stories. He's probably best known nowadays, especially in the English-speaking world, for his novels, with the singular exception of Death in Venice, the novella Death in Venice, which is still obviously quite famous in the United States. But there are pearls among even his earliest writing, his very youthful writing, and stretching all the way through to old age. And there are now 3 or 4 different collections of his short stories available in paperback that I really highly recommend people check out. And then if somebody is ready for a more ambitious read, The Magic Mountain is about to be released in a new translation that I'm certainly very much looking forward to. That'll be the 3rd translation that'll then be available in English. And it's a great novel that I've reread many times and that I think other people will enjoy as well. It's a novel full of great ideas, a novel that reflects its time of creation in the early 20th century. But you can set all that aside and just focus on the fact that it's also a very funny novel with many memorable characters, a truly memorable setting. It's a long work, but I think one that rewards reading and rereading every single time.
Tobias, thank you so much. I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. And I think on behalf of everybody who's been able to listen in, you've really shared your knowledge, your very long and deep-ranging knowledge of Thomas Mann with us really generously. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, everybody, for listening in. And I hope to be able to attend future festivals in person sometime.